Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive straight into a seriously provocative concept that asks a pretty chilling question. Are we voluntarily trading our cognitive souls for the ultimate convenience of artificial intelligence? I mean, we hear about AI constantly these days, right? How it saves us time, how it skyrockets our productivity. But what if the real cost isn't financial? What if the actual price tag is the very friction that makes human thought meaningful in the first place? So, let's unpack this and figure out exactly what we're giving up when we just let the machine do the thinking for us.
Imagine a truly intense visual metaphor, a demonic entity stepping up and offering you this incredibly powerful machine. But the catch is, you have to trade it for your struggle. It's explicitly equating that intellectual friction, that mental heavy lifting, with your very soul. The underlying promise is basically, hey, give up the hard work and this marvelous machine will just complete any thought you like. It's framing generative AI as way more than just a handy tool, it's pitching it as a literal Faustian bargain.
To really wrap our heads around where this heavy metaphor comes from, we actually need to rewind a bit to a 2002 quote by the eminent mathematician Sir Michael Atiyah. He framed the relationship between geometry and algebra as its own kind of deal with the devil. He argued that geometry is the soul. It requires spatial intuition, you have to visualize things, and it demands this deep, meaningful struggle with the universe's truths. Algebra, on the other hand, that's the machine. It's wildly powerful, for sure, but you can calculate algebraically completely blind. You just plug numbers into a formula and boom, you get an answer, without ever really intuitively understanding why. The concept we're looking at takes Atiyah's warning and maps it perfectly onto AI. The machine hands you the answer, but completely strips away your intuitive, meaningful cognitive struggle.
Unmasking the machine. Let's look at the math of the demon.
So, let's peel back the layers here and look at the algorithmic magic that's supposedly replacing our brain power. At the heart of generative AI is a pretty intimidating equation. It's the fundamental operating principle of autoregressive language models. And sure, it looks incredibly complex, but at the end of the day, what it represents is purely a statistical calculation. It's quite literally just calculating the exact probability of the next word occurring without possessing any actual understanding of the meaning behind those words. None whatsoever.
Let's break that math down into plain English, because it's actually fascinating. The variable WT is simply the next word the AI needs to predict. The W less than T is just the prompt that you typed in. The HT is the math representing that context. And finally, there's a softmax function, which just converts all those messy mathematical predictions into a simple, clean probability distribution between 0 and 1. And that's literally it. The AI looks at the text you gave it, maps it out mathematically, and spits out the most statistically likely next word from its massive vocabulary to seamlessly finish your sentence. It is not thinking, it is just predicting.
And as linguistic philosophers are quick to point out, these large language models have perfectly mastered the form of human language. I mean, they sound exactly like us, but they completely bypass the uniquely human semantic struggle of actual meaning-making. They lack any sensory grounding. They don't live in the physical world. They don't experience things. They are just highly advanced, stochastic completion engines. Essentially, they're replacing the human soul of intent with the blind calculus of probability.
The hollowing of the mind. Existential ergonomics and cognitive bypass.
So here's the million-dollar question. Why do we so eagerly accept this algorithmic completion of our thoughts, especially if we know it's costing us our intellectual friction? Well, cognitive psychologists say we fall into something called the sovereignty trap, and this happens because of existential ergonomics. Let's be totally honest with ourselves for a second. Thinking is exhausting. Wrestling with uncertainty and being fully mentally present takes a massive toll on us. We have a profound, hardwired biological desire to just relieve the strain of thinking. AI swoops in and answers this by instantly bypassing the deliberate effort we need to truly learn. But that trap snaps shut the moment we mistake that frictionless, instant access to an AI's answer for our own genuine personal ability.
On the surface, this might look like a clean, convenient little bargain. But the darker neurobiological reality is so much messier. When we constantly bypass the cognitive load required to learn, our minds literally begin to hollow out. And guys, this isn't just theory. Think about GPS for a minute. Studies have actually shown that our chronic reliance on GPS navigation leads to measurable spatial atrophy. Your hippocampus, the part of your brain responsible for mapping things out, actually shows reduced engagement when you blindly follow that little blue line on your phone. If a simple map app does that to our spatial awareness, we really have to ask, what is generative AI doing to our critical reasoning?
The philosophy of proletarianization, a historical hollowing out.
To truly grasp the stakes of what we're talking about, we need to widen the lens a bit. Let's look at this through the philosophy of the late French thinker Bernard Stiegler. He warned of a concept called proletarianization, which is basically a generalized loss of knowledge because we keep outsourcing our human capacities to machines. And you can track this in historical waves. In the 19th century, the craftsman lost his physical know-how to the factory machine. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the consumer lost their individual lifestyle to the standardization of mass media. But today, right now in the 21st century, we're facing the third wave. The conceptualizer is losing the ability to theorize, to judge, and to think critically, effectively abandoning it to algorithms. We are actively becoming cognitive proletarians, people who just passively consume ideas generated by a machine instead of creating them ourselves.
This loss of our internal creative process lines up absolutely perfectly with Martin Heidegger's warning about modern technology. He called it end-framing. End-framing is this logic where you treat everything in the world as a standing resource to be extracted and optimized for maximum efficiency. Generative AI pushes that logic way past the physical environment and reaches right inside our heads. It treats our very imagination, our memories, and our private thoughts as a standing reserve to be mined, optimized, and then sold right back to us, all in the name of convenience.
The psychology of struggle. Why hard things matter.
If giving up the struggle is the same as giving up our soul, we have to pause and ask a really fundamental question. Why do we inherently place a higher value on outcomes that require significant effort, pain, or struggle to achieve? From an evolutionary perspective, you'd think we'd biologically always want the easiest, lowest energy path, right? But psychological research into effort justification, and this dates all the way back to the 1950s, reveals something completely counterintuitive about human motivation. It turns out we actually need effort to construct meaning.
This next stat brilliantly illustrates exactly what I mean. 60%. That number represents the famous IKEA effect. Researchers at Harvard discovered that when we assemble products ourselves, when we invest our own sweat equity and navigate the sheer infuriating frustration of the task, we actually ascribe a 60% higher monetary value to those self-assembled goods compared to identical pre-assembled ones. The labor we put in leads directly to our attachment to the object. We overvalue it precisely because we struggled for it.
And this brings us to the effort heuristic. The perceived effort required to produce something is actually the underlying message beneath the message. Think about getting a handwritten letter versus a perfectly crafted AI-generated email. That handwritten letter carries immense emotional weight, doesn't it? Because you intuitively understand the time, the activation energy, and the physical struggle required by the other person to sit down and write it. The friction they endured is what provides the emotional value. An instant, effortlessly generated AI artifact is completely void of that underlying investment, making it feel socially and emotionally hollow.
It leads us to a really powerful realization. The struggle is not merely an obstacle to be overcome, it is the necessary psychological environment for human flourishing. Think about the concept of the flow state. You know, that deeply rewarding zone where your skills perfectly match a really tough challenge? By using AI to just remove the challenge and dial the difficulty down to zero, we completely eliminate our ability to enter that flow state. We're left feeling psychologically comfortable, sure, but fundamentally bored and completely alienated from our own potential.
Cultivating a fortified mind. Reclaiming cognitive sovereignty.
So, how do we build toward a solution? Because the good news is we aren't doomed to be hollowed out by the machine, provided we radically change how we interact with it. To reclaim our minds, we've got to stop treating generative AI like a passive calculator. A calculator is a passive instrument. It just executes an externally specified goal. But generative AI is an active instrument. It can reframe tasks, it can redefine variables, and it generates entirely new hypotheses. Because it acts as an active cognitive agent, it demands what researchers call an epistemology of contribution. Basically, that means it requires our intentional active oversight. We have to govern the tool, not just blindly operate it.
So how do you actually build this fortified mind? First, you have to recognize that sovereignty trap we talked about. Do not mistake the machine's output for your own personal brilliance. Second, practice cognitive reallocation. We should absolutely leverage the machine's incredible convenience, but we should strictly use it to offload the lower-level, mundane procedural tasks. The goal here is to fiercely defend and explicitly free up our intellectual bandwidth for rigorous reasoning and strategic oversight. And most importantly, we must intentionally inject friction back into our own workflows.
Which brings us to the brilliant concept of cognitive co-authorship. Instead of asking the AI to write an essay from scratch and completely ceding the struggle over to the machine, a sovereign user does the hard work first.
You write your own original proposition, you formulate your own thesis, and then you use the AI as a non-judgmental mirror and a sparring partner. You ask the machine to critically interrogate your ideas. By doing it this way, you're actively engaging in the cognitive struggle, you're defending your positions, rather than just bypassing the learning process altogether.
And that brings us to the ultimate question we all have to face in this algorithmic age. Will you let the machine complete your thoughts, or will you consciously choose to preserve the friction that gives your mind its meaning? The devil's offer of pure, frictionless convenience is always going to be sitting right there on your desktop. But true knowledge, true flourishing, and true identity, those are forged in the fire of effort. The real choice you have to make today is whether you will intentionally cultivate the struggle that makes you human. Definitely something to think about before you hit generate.